The Boomerang Mk.2 is a rare premium fighter in War Thunder's British Air Tree. Let's check it out. The CAC Boomerang was the first military combat aircraft designed and built in Australia, and the full story of its development could be a 10-part Netflix miniseries. The short and oversimplified version is that during the late 1930s, it was obvious to the Australians that they needed to develop a domestic aviation industry. To that end, they negotiated local production of the Whirlaway, which was their localized domestic version of the American NA-16 trainer, and also the British Beaufort bomber. As World War II broke out in the Pacific, there were some serious internal discussions in Australia about whether or not they could depend on foreign deliveries of military aircraft, and after a fair amount of analysis, they decided to push forward with the development and production of a domestic fighter aircraft. Several foreign engineers were brought on board, which could be a pretty long side story of its own, and in the end, they decided to use the Whirlaway as the base for the new aircraft, since it was felt that a lot of the existing tooling could probably be reused with only minimal work. The resulting aircraft ended up being only partially related to the Whirlaway, as most of the plane's important structures were reworked and modernized for what became the Boomerang. The initial prototypes of the Boomerang had some problems, as most new military aircraft did in those days, being literally designed with drawing paper and slide rules, but it was considered promising enough to push ahead, and they eventually refined it into a production version of the plane that entered service almost immediately after examples were coming off of the production line. However, since it had taken so long to get the Boomerang operational, the pressing need for them had waned somewhat, and they ended up only seeing very limited service in World War II. There were no known aerial combat victories, and sporadic ground attack sorties represented the majority of its combat service. Only 250 were built, and the Boomerang was retired from service after the war. What we get in War Thunder is the Boomerang Mk.2. This was a slightly upgraded version of the original plane, and it sits in Rank 2 of the British Air Tree with a battle rating of 3.0. Originally, this was a premium vehicle that could be bought with Golden Eagles, but it was placed underneath the Boomerang Mk.1, meaning that you had to already own the Mk.1, which was also a premium aircraft, before you could get the Mk.2. It was removed from the tree last year, and by all accounts it's a somewhat rare aircraft, as it seems not many people picked it up since it was really only a minor improvement over the Mk.1, which they already had to have before they were even eligible to buy the Mk.2. In this review, I'm focusing on the Mk.2, but almost everything I'm presenting here also applies to the Mk.1. Now, the Mk.2 is armed with a pair of 20mm Hispano cannons and 4 50 caliber machine guns. All of these are out on the wings, and convergence angles are relevant with this and something to think about. The ammo belts it gets provide a pretty good selection, and you can probably find something for whatever play style, suits your fancy at the lower tiers. My personal choice is for the air target belts in the cannons and the tracer belts in the machine guns. The Boomerang Mk.2 can also carry an external loadout of 2 light bombs. In fact, the addition of the 2 bombs is really the main difference between the Mk.1 and the Mk.2 Boomerangs. The bombs themselves are pretty small and require almost a direct hit to take out targets. The Boomerang's flight performance is skewed a bit towards low-altitude combat. The rate of climb feels good at first, but once you hit 2,000 or 3,000 meters, it drops off significantly. The good news is that at those lower altitudes, it generally does pretty well. In air combat, the Boomerang is a fairly effective turn fighter, and it's able to credibly engage most of its low-tier opposition in one-on-one fights. Zeros and Spitfires will give it serious trouble, but most other planes will eventually lose in any kind of a rate fight. The one real performance weakness the plane has is its engine. It's a fair bit underpowered, which means that its acceleration and top-end speed aren't quite as good as its competition, so this is one of those planes where, if at all possible, you want to try and dive into combat, even if it's just a small dive, so that you'll have an energy advantage over your opponent. Also, speaking of its engine, it's a bit fragile. It overheats in WEP very quickly, and even just a few light machine gun hits from an enemy bomber's gun turret can destroy the cooling system, or just take out the engine completely. That ends up being a pretty limiting factor with the Boomerang. Most of the time, the thing just can't take hits. In a few of the clips in this review, I was able to absorb some small caliber machine gun fire, but even just a couple of hits to more important parts of the plane will generally light this thing up like a box full of matchsticks. I say with no shame that I get shot down in the Boomerang almost every time I fly it out, simply because it's meant to be a close-in dogfighter and it usually finds itself in a furball, but it's just so damn fragile that even a few hits from AI-controlled AAA or low-caliber 30 caliber guns can cripple this thing. Speaking of which, when you fly the Boomerang Mk.2 out into missions, your tactical positioning at the start of an engagement will end up being a lot more important than with some of the other low-tier planes. The main reason is that underpowered engine, along with its general fragility. It's worth mentioning that if the Boomerang takes any damage at all, its performance usually suffers pretty bad, and flying this plane will give you no small amount of exasperated sighs, as an unlucky hit from a 30 caliber machine gun does just enough damage to the tail or wings to cripple your turn performance, right when you're in the middle of tangling with multiple opponents. If at all possible, try to climb a bit at the start of a match until your rate of climb seems to drop off. Level out and gain some forward airspeed. Then get close to your opponents and try to dive into combat so that you can at least attempt to maintain an energy advantage through a close-in dogfight. The good news is that the Boomerang is very maneuverable, and its Hispano cannons hit pretty hard, so the dogfight kills won't be especially difficult most of the time, unless you end up in a slow crawl and the other guy simply outperforms you in raw engine power. Now, as I mentioned already, the main difference between the Boomerang Mk.1 and Mk.2 is the pair of 250-pound bombs that the Mk.2 gets. This gives the option to fly this out and attack a couple of ground targets before going into air combat. The catch is that taking the bombs significantly degrades the plane's performance, enough so that you'll actually notice. And the bombs aren't very large, so if you're going into ground battles as close air support, you're basically going to need a direct hit to pop anything heavier than like a Rank 1 scout vehicle or some light anti-air unit. Still, it's nice to have the flexibility, and it's entirely possible to use the bombs in air battles to just attack targets of opportunity on the ground. Visually, the Boomerang Mk.2 is a very rugged-looking aircraft that kind of looks like a Whirlaway crossed with a P-47, to me anyway, and I think it's pretty decent looking overall. There aren't any custom paint jobs or anything, but really the default one is fine. Landing is something you'll want to practice once or twice with this plane. The plane can drop its gear at around 300 kilometers an hour, but it can only drop landing flaps at around 220, and since its engine power isn't that great, you'll need to pay really careful attention to your throttle during the landing run to avoid stalling out short of the runway. The good news is, you can usually just hold the brakes on landing without much worry of tipping over forward, so that's something at least. Now I gotta say, I really like the cockpit of the Boomerang. The pilot sits pretty high, which I like, and the visibility is great. The bracing doesn't get in the way as much as I expected, the instruments are convenient, and the gun sight is easy to use. Good cockpit. To close out on the CAC Boomerang Mk.2. This plane has strong forward firepower for a low-tier vehicle. It's a decent turn fighter. it's got a couple of bombs, and it gets premium bonuses. However, it seems like the entire plane is built out of flammable matchsticks. In the event it survives combat damage, its performance drops off significantly, and its engine really just isn't up to par. The final verdict on the Boomerang Mk.2 is that this plane feels like a very balanced premium vehicle, with good dogfighting performance, but its low engine output stops it from being too overpowered. If you see this come up during an anniversary sale or as an event prize, consider picking it up if you're in the mood for a good, low-tiered British premium vehicle. As always, thanks for watching.